A questo punto inizia la trasmissione. Tutti i partecipanti sono in grado solo di ascoltare.
Everyone, if you're listening from Europe, thank you for connecting. This is the fourth webinar of the ENOS Experience Sharing Focus Groups. I am Thomas Le Guénon from the RGM, and I will share the session today. As an introduction, I would just remind you about the ENOS project very briefly. It's a European project funded by the H2020 program. It means Enabling Onshore Storage, and it has a variety of activities dedicated to enabling onshore storage. Today, we are most interested in the international cooperation work package, which aims at knowledge sharing between the various sites and the various contexts of CO2 storage. We have a program dedicated to site twinnings between the sites from ENOS and other international sites. We have a leakage simulation alliance for very shallow migration tests. And today we have a webinar of what we call experience sharing focus groups. For more information about the ENOS project in general, you can check our website, enosproject.eu. So, experience sharing focus groups, what are they? It's events dedicated to all researchers and sites around the world, so it's more dedicated to the scientific community. We base each event around specific issues, and for the duration of the project, we have 7 webinars and 3 workshops planned, each on a predefined topic, and it's slightly different than research priorities, so it's slightly different than usual workshops or conferences. Here, the goal is to remove practical hurdles that can prevent a successful pilot site. You can see on the right of the screen the topics we have for each webinar. And today, you know, the topic is on public communication and engagement in CO2 storage projects. We will have next webinar dedicated to quick analysis of that data. We will have a webinar in 2020 dedicated to relationship with decision makers, which is similar but not the same as the topic we have today. And we have a topic in November that's still to be determined. So if you have suggestions or if you want to speak about a subject that you think would be interesting to us, you can contact me. You have my mail here, t.leguenon@brgm.fr. And for previous, if you're interested in a topic of a previous webinar, all our webinars are recorded. You can check them on the webpage dedicated to experience sharing focus groups, or you can check the ENOS project channel on YouTube, and you can find the previous webinar. Today, the topic is public communication and engagement in the development of CO2 storage projects. I will briefly introduce the subjects, but I guess the speakers will do a better job than I will. So, CO2 storage project is like any industrial operation, and its implementation will require a robust communication plan, and in particular with the general public. It's often perceived, I guess, that the main goal is to manage potential opposition. It's one thing that is feared, I would say, in the CO2 storage community. But I guess one thing we will see today is that a good relationship with local communities and stakeholders can have far more benefits than just managing opposition. The goal today is to present some real-life experience of public communication associated with a CO2 project, and we will also introduce key lessons learned from this experience and also some reviews. The agenda for today, so I'm in the introduction and I will stop very soon. Then the first talk will be by Aaron Defina from CO2 CRC in Australia. And he will talk about their experience in Outway, and the title of the talk is 360 Degrees Stakeholder Management. Then we'll have a talk from the ENOS project from Will Knight of the Nottingham University. And the title is Taking the Lead from Citizens' Experiences of Co-producing Public Engagement with CCS. Then we'll have a talk from the Align CCUS project, and it will be presented by Christine Boomsma from Leiden University. And the talk is entitled Community Compensation in the Context of Carbon Capture and Storage, Key Debates and Current Practices. I will try to keep this talk on time, so we'll have a 20-minute Q&A session at the end. Regarding the webinar, if you're not familiar with the GoToWebinar, right now all your microphones and webcams are mute. If you want to interact with the speakers, you have a question panel, and you can ask questions. We will see the webinar, we will see the question, and then I can transfer them to the speakers. Otherwise, you can also raise your hand. You have a small button, and in that case, I can give you unmute your microphone, and you can speak and ask your question directly. Finally, I would like to thank all the speakers who agreed to participate in these webinars. Then all the people who made contact with the speakers and participate in the organization. So we have Max Watson from CO2 CRT, Matthew Humphrey from Nottingham University, Samuela Vercelli from University of Roma, Emma Termors from Leiden University, Tom Mikunda from TNO, and Vitladik from CGS, who is the leader also of the International Cooperation Work Package in ENOS. Last but not least, thanks to all the OGS staff that is helping us with the logistics, Georgia Pina, William Tosson, and Julia Massolino. That's all for the introduction. So now let's start immediately with the first speaker, which is Aaron Defina.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Hello. Okay, you're now the presenter.
Marvelous. Hold on. Fantastic. Thank you all very much for inviting me to present to you guys today. This is a great honour for me down in Australia, and a good morning to you all, and it's good evening from me down here. Now, I'm Aaron Defina. I'm the Health, Safety, Environment and Quality and Compliance Manager for CO2 CRC, and I'm going to present today on our stakeholder engagement processes that we've used down at our world-class Otway research facility. Research is no different to any other operational activity, so nothing to with other organisations running normal commercial plants. And without good stakeholder relationships, we wouldn't have been able to have a research organisation and operation going on in our area. So stakeholder management is important no matter where you come from. And as much as I'd like to claim credit and put it on my resume, this process was started well before I joined CO2 CRC, so I've got to thank the previous practitioners. They need all the credit. But something that'll give a unique view from mine to here, and for anyone asking me questions, is I haven't always been working at CO2 CRC, obviously. I was also a stakeholder in as much as I was a manager at the site with the contractors that operated the site. And then for 4 years, I was the chief regulator in the state who actually regulated this process and this project. So I actually had a unique stakeholder involvement over the last decade plus of operations that the site's gone on down in the Otway. So I have a very unique perspective from all three sides. Now, hold on. There we go. Before I go into our stakeholder management, I'd like to just give you a little bit of a history of the facility and CO2 CRC so that you can understand our stakeholder management processes. CO2 CRC started in 2004 as part of the Australian Government's Cooperative Research Centre program. So it has a 10-year lifespan fixed in under the government's terms of engagement. And it was set up because it was an identified need in Australia to research into carbon capture and storage processes as a way to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. As part of the starting of that process, we needed to understand a place to store this. We had to identify a project location. So going forward, the Otway site was located in Western Victoria in Australia. And just so that you know, it wasn't the only site that was investigated. There was 4 sites that were being looked at until the Otways was chosen. There was a set of key selection criteria to actually choose that site that was gone through. Once the Otway site was selected, we then executed stage 1 of the project. So the Otway site was selected in 2004, and in 2008, we injected 65,000 tonnes of CO2-rich gas into a depleted gas reservoir as part of the first ideas behind carbon capture and storage, which is using old oil fields and old gas fields to store the carbon capture. And apologies if you're watching my webcam, when I wave, it's because the lights in here are on a timer because it's dark and they turn off to save power. So stage 1 was successful and world-leading research happened. Further research was identified as being needed as part of carbon capture and storage, so that whilst we were there, we were looking at the research going forwards, and they identified that greenhouse gases would need to be stored in other formations so that you weren't going to always be nearby and having a depleted gas reservoir near your sources, so they had to work it out. So they identified deep saline aquifers, and luckily we had those identified around our site, and they're identified so that we could actually do some research into that second tranche of storage formations going forwards. So we started doing that as well. And in 2014, the agreement with the Commonwealth government ended. That was a decade, the 10 years of funding, but the research hadn't finished. So the organisation changed from a government organisation to a private, not-for-profit company to allow research to continue using the Otway facility. So then in 2015 and 16, we finished the stage 2 project, and we injected 15,000 tonnes of gas into a saline formation to demonstrate the minimum detection volumes that you could use to find gas you put into those formations, so that then we could help determine monitoring and verification limits and help regulators and corporations decide what they could see using monitoring techniques. And so there were further successes with that. And then going forwards, we've worked out that there's more work that needs to be done around the monitoring and verification, which is subsurface monitoring to reduce the amount of impacts we have on the environment and the local communities, and that because that's what they've been telling us. And we've just recently received FID approval from our board to go ahead and do stage 3, which is another injection into that saline formation, and then do some testing of the new monitoring technologies that we're going to do from subsurface to do that. So that's the next stage. So we're going on forward. So now that you understand what we've gone through, you can see that there's been 3 distinct tranches of operations, if you want to say, or projects at the site, which then if we go to the next stage, you'll see that then that gives us, as part of our strategic direction, it shows you that we've had 3 distinct projects we've needed to then go and consult with our stakeholders around. And that's all of our stakeholders. So initially when we went out and we were talking to everybody, it's a single 10-year project. Stage 1, depleted gas reservoirs. But then as we keep going forwards and we keep changing it, we have to keep talking to our stakeholders around what we're going to do. Now, as you can imagine, stakeholder engagement, depends upon the number of stakeholders that you've got. And, so that's the amount of work that you need to do. So, you've got to look at all the important stakeholders who are public supporters of the project, the government, the industry, the researchers, the local communities, the local industries. There's a whole lot of stuff that you've got to do. So when you look at that and you look at the number of times that we've had to go and do it, we've had to develop a fairly good process of identifying our stakeholders and then working out how to communicate our projects with them, because without that, without their support, the project's not going to keep going. You're not going to keep having engagement from the stakeholders who are supporting us, as well as the stakeholders who are, as in the people giving us the money to do the research, as well as the communities who are allowing us to do our research in their area. So what I want to do here is just to talk about the processes that we've done. And one thing that I do want to put up here is a current list of our stakeholders, not the local communities, but the strong relationships that we've got with the government, the research organisations and the agencies in Australia and around the world that are doing work with us. Because without the support of those stakeholders, as well as the local community and everything else, the project won't work. So it's something that I want to make sure that everybody understands is, lots of people see stakeholder engagement as just with your local community, and they're the people who, you know, you've got to make sure are with you and aware of you, because if they don't support you, then you're going to have the local public opposition. But there's also all the other stakeholders that you need to identify and work with as well. And it's not only all of the research organisation and the governments and the agencies that support us, but we also then talk about, you know, the community, the regulators, the media. So there's a whole lot of other stakeholders that you need to engage with, and that's really important that you identify and engage them and develop processes around how to work with them, how to keep them informed, you know, and all those sort of things. So if we look at that and we go back to the start, stakeholder engagement started early 2004. And you're sitting there going, but, you know, okay, that's when the project started, but you didn't have a site. And that was one of the key things that was identified as part of the project, was engaging with the stakeholders really, really early. And that's something that comes out from every project that you'll see going forwards into the future. You can never start your engagement early enough. And you can never start talking to people early enough. So that when we started going and talking to the stakeholders, the local communities and things, because we had the support from these organisations, we were talking to the local communities of all of the possible sites that we could use. So we started to talk to every organisation before we'd even selected the site. So here we are talking to the local community in Western Australia and Victoria and New South Wales and saying, we're looking at conducting research in your area. So we started to do those things, and we started to put those good practices in place of talking to people early and often. So that was done. We did community meetings, we did individual meetings with the people who wanted them, you know, the landholders that it might be actually, you know, involving and working on their lands, because we've got to get their permission to do it. So we started that early, open and transparent. Once the site was selected, we then started to focus on doing the further work about then starting to talk to the people about the sites that we were going to work on and the communities that we were going to live in. Now in 2005, one of the things that CO2 CRC did was undertook independent social research in the Otway community, so that's where we're based. And we started to talk to them about that and question them about, you know, what they understood of carbon capture and storage, what they understood of global warming in general, as well as all of the other things that we need to do. You know, how do you understand the project? Are you aware of what we're planning on doing in the area? All those sort of things. So once we got all that information, it then informed our plans going forwards. You know, it addressed their concerns. We worked out what they were worried about, and we put that into the plans going forward. So that was important. One of the other really key things, and I don't know whether it applies to anyone else over there, but when we first started with this project, there was no actual regulatory regime in place to regulate this operation. So we had to then start working with the regulatory agencies to work out how we could get this approved. What was the appropriate way for this project to be approved, to be able to be done legally in the Victoria, and then to also give the communities confidence that it was being watched by the regulators, you know, being observed to make sure that we were doing the right things. So that was the engagement that we did going forwards. And, you know, we worked that out, and part of that was, you know, making sure that we'd identified all the stakeholders. So if we go forwards to the next slide, here's a list of all of the stakeholders that we'd identified as part of stage one. So we're looking back into the future. Excuse me. And then you look at these, and then what we've done is we've put them into groups. So what we put them into groups for was you then identify appropriate processes to engage with those stakeholder groups, so that you're going to be dealing with all of the research organisations and the universities in a similar way. You're going to be dealing with the regulators in a similar way. And part of it allows you to be open and transparent. So when we're talking to the regulators, you turn around and you say, look, you each tell us what you want, and we'll put it all together in one package, and then we'll give you all the same information. So we want to make sure that it addresses your specific needs, but you're also aware of what we're giving to other people. And it's the same with the landowners. You talk to the landowners in the local community and you say, look, what are you worried about? And if it's commercially practical and available and it's not going to upset them, you'll make sure that you share the information equally with everybody. So it allows us to do those things. And so then you assess those groups and you make sure that you consult and communicate with each of those groups in a way that's agreed so that it works for those groups. Now, as you can look through those and you look at the tops, you can see that each of the groups will have different requirements as part of their stakeholder engagement. So, you know, and if we go through and we do a quick summary, you'll have the research providers. You know, their main aim is to get the data from the experiments and report on the projects and to share information to enable, you know, people to make decisions around it. You look at the core industries, and they're the guys who are interested in what's happening around carbon capture and storage, so that they can then start to drive their business decisions and look at things and be informed about what's going forwards. You look at the government participants. Now, the government wanted the information around these so they can start to inform policies around how they're going to meet their emission reduction commitments whilst maintaining support for their local industries and energy security. They can be responsible for grants as well, because we're not only funded by industry, we're funded by government grants. So, you know, they're looking at that, and they'll have requirements on how we report against, you know, how we've spent their money. So we look at those sort of things going forwards. You've got the regulatory agencies, you know, obviously with those guys, they want proof of protection of community to make sure that you're complying with best practices and, you know, you've identified all the risks and you're protecting them from any of your impacts that your site might potentially cause. You know, you've got it under control, and that keeps the community happy. We've got supporting participants. Now, they're the ones who are, it's an interesting thing because CO2 CRC isn't an organisation that's got the skills or the size to operate a site. So what we've done with supporting participants was bring in experienced people to actually run the site on our behalf. So, you know, we brought those in and we brought them in, and they've got certain requirements about what we need. And then you've also got issues around the media, you know, because we've engaged with them all the time to keep them informed, to be open and honest and transparent. And it provides another way of distributing information to all the other stakeholders. So the media will go and get information out to all of your other stakeholders. So, you know, that's an important way of engaging and doing it with those people. So once we've done all of those things as part of our stakeholder identification, which was done early on in 2005 before we'd even started all of our activities, then we started to look at the stakeholder management process. Now, as I said before, our stakeholder group's pretty different to a normal commercial operation because we've got relationships with the researchers. So right now we've got 150 researchers from 32 various organisations in addition to all of the industry partners and everything else. So that you've got to start working around those things and identifying all of the different commitments and making sure that all of the stakeholders are aware of what's going on. So the initial commitments to those stakeholders were identified in the plans and agreements that were undertaken as part of stage one. You know, and the key for those things that was worked out as part of the social research that we did beforehand and all the talking to all of the stakeholders would talk about what we're going to do and then do what we've talked about. You know, there's no surprises for those guys. And then based upon what's agreed, you know, we ended up with having regular meetings with the regulators to discuss the project process, the project's progress. Apologies for that. Meetings with the local landowners. You know, community reference groups. So we identified that they wanted a community group. So we organised that and had an independent chair coming from the local shire, the local council. And we invite all the stakeholders to that. So not just the local community, but the regulators, the government, the research providers, so they can all turn up. We published peer-reviewed research so that everybody could see what was being done from there. And then we had formal media events. So all of those things and the early adoption of those things contributed to the early establishment of really good stakeholder relationships with CO2 CRC. And as I said before, you know, early and transparent communication was the key that was identified by everybody, you know, so that you can then earn their trust, so that you're going forwards and doing that. And then, of course, as you can understand, you know, when we went through, you're going forwards, and as soon as we're starting to identify that we're going to be going on beyond the first 10 years of the operations, you know, we needed to have communications with the stakeholders as early as we can, because, you know, lots of the communities and landowners were making decisions based upon the information we've given them up front, which was we're here for 10 years and then we're out. But that then changed. So then we've gone through and talked to them. And one of the things when we worked out that we were going to go for further than the 10 years was we undertook the independent social research again so that we could see how our practices were going. Did it work? Was it informing the community? How was their understanding of the project? How was their understanding of the global processes around this? Their understanding of carbon capture and storage? So we made sure that we went back, and it gave us the ability to check what was going on. So I then provided information on how interwoven aspects of the community awareness and active engagement, the technical understanding have helped in achieving the acceptance of the project by the local community and all the stakeholders. But it also highlighted to us the difficulties of communicating highly technical concepts to a broad and dispersed population. So that was really something key that came out of it. And then, but it confirmed the processes. And one of the key things that it really showed us, and it's something that if I can communicate and everyone understands, is by being part of the local community. Now, one of our things that was advised early on was having a local, dedicated, community-based liaison officer. And it's an important method of consultation and two-way communication with the community. Because they're a part of the community, they understand all of the community needs. So they'll understand what else is going on in the community, not just the things that we as the outside operators look at and you go, oh, that impacts directly to there. But they've got a feeling for what else is going on. Is there anything else happening outside of CO2 CRC that's causing them angst or concerns? So that was that. You know, you just can't overstate how important it is to be a part of the local community. So we made sure that we kept doing that, and we made sure that we updated our plans based upon the independent social research, and we just kept going so that we kept the suitable outcomes going forward. And another thing that we did is we went on and we reviewed our stakeholder management as each time as we've gone through, and now we're doing it again as part of the stage 3. We're extending the project for a second time. Actually, it's a third time. Is we went back and we looked at the stakeholders and looked at different ways of classifying the stakeholders based upon their attributes. And we've started to look at some research that's been done, and there was Mitchell 1997 who did some research on stakeholder salience. And you look at the attributes around that, and we're talking about power, legitimacy, and urgency. And so when you look at this stuff and you go through it, you know, it's a dynamic model around stakeholders. It's not fixed. You don't just do something with a stakeholder, because the way they react with you and the way that those attributes do, they can vary. So that then a stakeholder can vary their classifications as to how you then work out how you handle them, because you're looking at salience, which is how urgently you respond to them, you know, and you've got core industry and supporting partners, which is, you know, there's agreed processes and all that sort of stuff, whereas you might have the landowners and local communities who have, you know, urgent needs and they want an answer urgently because it's affecting, you know, for one of their birds, their land, their community, what they're going on. So this is a really interesting thing that we looked at and going, okay, if we're dealing with these dynamic classifications around stakeholders, are the processes we've got in place working, you know? So we went back and just made sure that we were doing it. And the key observation we got that one is that we give priority to the competing stakeholders' claims, and you've got to work through that. And the theory around this is that the stakeholder management has to vary as your activities occur and as stakeholders interact with the organisation. So you become a very dynamic organisation in the way that you deal with the stakeholders, and you're giving credence to their claims and their requirements and their efforts and everything else. So our management plan over time, we found out, had been doing that already. That's how we've been running it with the local community people and the people in the office. So that was really good, and because it worked so well, we went, yep, we're reinforcing what we're doing, so we're going to keep doing it. And then so for the final part of what I want to just talk to you about is what we're doing going forwards into the future. So as I've said to you before, we've attempted to involve all of its identified stakeholders in the communications in as many ways as possible and equally as possible and transparently as possible. Openness, transparency, timely notification and willingness to accept feedback all contribute to a CO2 CRC, you know, maintaining successful relationships with all of our stakeholders, no matter who they are and no matter who they're working with inside the organisation as well. We've always consistently attempted to share information which assists stakeholders in communicating not only with ourselves, but also with each other. So when you think about it, you come to a community reference group, we're telling a stakeholder about what the regulator's saying. If the regulator's in the room, they can go and ask the regulator and get confirmation about what we've said. And it's a really important thing to do. It's keeping everybody involved and sharing the information that's going around. You know, the minutes are provided to everybody to make sure that if they do CRG, so that all the stakeholders who've attended those things see that sort of stuff. We also hold open days. Now, you know, we actually open the site up to anybody who's around. You know, we put on a day where they can come and see what we do and talk to all the staff and ask questions. You know, the regulators are there, they're invited as well, the industry people are there. So there's all that sort of stuff, so the people can just come there and see what's changed and ask questions, and we'll do educational events with children, all those sort of things. Now, in addition to the wide-ranging community stakeholder events, we also have regular communications in accordance with agreements of all the other stakeholders. So we send letters out to people telling them what's coming up. We send letters out to people telling them about what activities are coming. We tell them about planned future activities before we've even done, you know, we've even approved that we're going to do it. We start to talk to people about what we're thinking we need to do, and that's why when we've had those 3 different stages and projects go through that we've been able to keep going, because we've been keeping everybody updated. As soon as those ideas come in, we start to tell them. So it's not a surprise when all of a sudden, you know, yep, we've been given approval to do X and X turns up on the site in a month. So, you know, the regular discussions with the regulators too regarding the site activities, both existing and proposed, has been essential to having their ongoing support, so they know what we're doing and know what's coming up forwards. So, you know, that's been really important, because in Australia, this was the first site that actually went and did all these tests and things, so that, you know, we're setting the precedents, and there's questions that are being asked from the local regulators because it's informing them about how they're going to interact with other people. And, you know, they'll be informing their regulatory cohorts around Australia about, oh, you know, we talk about this, and as a regulator, I know that you have the conversations in the background and saying, someone's talking about doing this. What is it that we think they need to do? You know, what is it that they do? So by talking to the regulators, we're helping other people go through and making sure that we're complying with everything else. And it allows them to do that, and we're open and honest with the regulators and say, come and talk to us whenever you want to see something. Come and have a look at a well, come and have a look at this, come and have a look at that. and the continuing engagement with not only the regulators, but the government, industry and researchers, and ensure that they're engaged in the progress of the projects, they share the successes, and they're able to use the information for their purposes, as well as giving them the opportunity to suggest future activities. Now, in wrapping up, you know, our stakeholder management successes come from the process of identifying the stakeholders and working with them to get a common understanding of the needs and how we'll address them. And then we always communicate openly and honestly to all and any stakeholders in early and transparent ways. So, you know, I can only just reinforce those things and say, when you're doing it, do it. And I went to a previous conference last week, and the guy said, when you want to start consulting is N-1, and N is the date that you think you should be consulting. So start the day before you think you should. So thank you very much, and I'll be on the line. I'll let my other presenters go forward, and I'm happy to ask questions at the end of the session. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. That was really interesting. So we're running a little bit behind schedule. So if you have a question, just use the question panel. So we have a log of the questions, and we can ask it back to Aaron at the end of the session. I will now give the floor to Will. Hello, Will. And you are now a presenter.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, and thank you everyone for coming out and listening today. Probably a bit later in the day than it is for us over here, crack of dawn for us. But today I'll be talking about our experiences from Work Package 5 of the ENOS project, which focuses on community engagement with CCS and with the ENOS project. So my name's Will Knight, and together with my colleague Matt Humphrey from the University of Nottingham, we worked on the Work Package 5 community engagement for the ENOS project. And we work alongside the Geoenergy Testbed, which is a research site based just outside Nottingham here in the UK. And at that site, it's an experimental site looking at the movement of CO2 through shallow aquifers as a way of testing monitoring equipment, which could be obviously scaled up to larger projects. So just to give you an overview today, we're going to be talking about the work we've been doing with a local citizen group in Nottingham, exploring ways of working with them for the creation of public engagement materials and ways of engaging members of the public in technical issues such as carbon capture and storage on a general basis, and also in the local level as well in terms of the project that we're running over at the Geoenergy Testbed. So we've been working on this part of the project since September last year. We've had 7 sessions since then. And we have a group of around 10 local people. We identified this group through a market research company. We said to them we'd like people local to the Nottingham area, and got a wide range of people from different socio-economic backgrounds. So, for example, we have a company director, we have a hairdresser, a labourer, some people who work in events, some teachers. So it's a real mixed group of people, which is really helpful in just terms of getting different viewpoints and perspectives on the issue. And since September, we've tried to meet the group around about once a month. And we're trying to cover the key aspects of CCS and the work of ENOS, but we are being led by the citizens' questions. And this is going to become a key point for us, is this idea of following the citizens in terms of what they want to know about carbon capture and storage, rather than what we think they should know about it. And each of the sessions are led by myself and my colleague Matt, and we always have a technical specialist as well. Matt and I are social scientists, not technical scientists, so we use a technical specialist. Often is Kerry Vincent from the BGS. She very kindly comes along and supports a lot of our sessions and provides that technical insight into the topics. So I've mentioned this idea of co-production, and this is in the title as well, and this is a key aspect for how we wanted to approach this research. We think part of the main goal for the ENOS Work Package 5 project is looking at how you can develop public engagement materials and documents which will help other sites and future CCS projects to engage more effectively with local stakeholders and local communities. And this is done through the generation of questions around CCS which citizens may have. So in our group sessions with our local citizens, we always get them to ask questions, and we record the conversations, and any questions they have we write down around CCS, and we're using those as a way of developing a set of materials which guide and inform future CCS engagement. But the way we're trying to do this is through what we call co-production, and this is working with a group of lay people to create a product or an outcome. In this case, it is those public engagement materials. And by doing that, we are following their questions and listening to what they want to know about, and then providing them with that information, rather than standing up and sort of lecturing or presenting long presentations around aspects of CCS. We tend to go for quite a short presentation and then listen to what their questions are, and then develop the next set of the next meeting or the next engagement event around a particular topic that they've shown an interest in. So this is an example of one of the sessions we've had so far. As I said, the sessions are led by the citizens. So for example, we recently held a session on the economics of carbon capture and storage in Europe, because our citizens were asking around how carbon capture and storage fits into an economic model, how it might be profitable for a company, and how it fits in with the European carbon framework. So we brought in an environmental economist who presented and talked to our citizens about that particular topic. So each session leads on from the previous one, and we always try and start with an icebreaker as well. So just a small session just to get people talking and to clear any tension. We always try and sit in a sort of a circle as well. So the presenters at the front, but then we always try and sit in a circle where possible to try and give everyone equal opportunity. We're trying to avoid any sort of assumptions of hierarchical power or influence between the citizens and the researchers. If we have got a technical presentation, we'll have a short presentation on the topic, and then we'll split the group into little teams, and they will discuss the topic, write down any questions on paper, and then after sort of 20 minutes or so, we'll come back together with that group and talk as a whole around the questions that have been raised. And they have an opportunity for the citizens to talk and question each other and the specialists that we have at the time as well. So just to give you an idea of how that has worked to date, we began back in September with a general introduction to ENOS and to CCS. Following on from that, we examined the questions we had from the first interview, the first session. And we found that there are a lot of questions around more of the technical aspects of CCS, how it might work, the complexities of it. So we created a presentation on the well-to-well examination. So effectively, the production of hydrocarbons and then through to the safe storage of carbon dioxide at the end of the process. So covering that whole life cycle of CCS in depth. From there, we then went on to a site visit at the BGS, where the citizens were able to see the core store, some of the laboratories, and have presentations from geologists working in CCS. So it gave them a really good sort of technical understanding of what we're trying to do, and found that to be very useful. Our citizens really appreciated being taken off-site and shown the business end of carbon capture and storage research and how it might work. So we took them out of that classroom environment almost, and we found that to be really beneficial. From that, we had questions around the sort of site characterization of CCS, where you would pick store CCS and why it might be in that place. So we had a conversation around that. And from there, we had this question of the economics of CCS. So how does it fit into a wider picture? Who pays for CCS if there's not a tax? If there is a tax of carbon, how might that work? Is it better to have a tax or an incentive scheme? These sort of questions. So we had a conversation on that. And then from this, we started to sort of explore the local issues of carbon capture and storage, so how it might affect local communities, how it might affect them. And we were asking our citizens groups to imagine that they were a local community and there was a carbon capture and storage site being proposed nearby. How might they react? What sort of questions would they have? And how would they like to see information and scientists, regulators, the industry engage with them as a local community around this development? And there were some really interesting conversations that came up around how they would like to see that. And from those conversations, we got to our last meeting, which we had 2 weeks ago, where they were interested in how it's safely monitored, and how CCS development is monitored and regulated. And from that, Kerry Vincent from the BGS was able to give to talk to them about how we monitor CCS sites, what to look out for, what the warning signs might be, and what would happen if there was a leak of any sort. So as you can see, we've really tried to take our lead from what the citizens want to know rather than assuming what they want to know around CCS, and to develop a program of conversations and events which are very informal and which are led explicitly by what they want to know on the topic. And we've seen from this a real change in the way our citizens are engaging with us, with our experts, and the sorts of questions they're asking. So I've just got 2 examples here of the questions which we asked them to produce as part of each breakout session. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we have the questions from the very first meeting we did, and they're very general questions around: is CCS safe? Where would you store it? How far underground is it? Who pays for it? So these sort of quite general questions were coming up. By the sort of the 6th meeting, where we'd really started to explore the concepts and really explore the technical aspects, the questions became much more specific. So ask questions around how big a storage site might be. We had questions around: is how big an area does the cap rock cover? Can CCS just go along the cap rock until it ends? So quite sort of technical, detailed questions were coming out, and we were starting to explore more around those local issues as well, and moving beyond the technical aspects of the topic. So some of the sort of the key questions and comments that have come out of this work so far is the idea that CCS needs to be placed into the broader context. We're starting to see that our citizens, once we sort of explain CCS and they've understood the need or the urgency for it, they are very keen and think it's a good idea in principle, but they're skeptical of how it might work and whether it's economically feasible. So a question that comes back a lot to is this idea of who pays for CCS. Is it us as citizens, or is it through taxation, or is it companies who pollute? Do they pay for it? But if they have to increase costs, does that get passed on to the consumer? And these sort of things. So it's very sort of concerns around how it might work in practice. And then we've had conversations around whether a country would politically decide to go for CCS if it's the only one doing it. So there's concern within our group that if the UK goes and does CCS, is there much point to it because there are bigger polluters like China or the United States? And if they're not doing it, is it really worth us doing it? So there's some questions around that sort of thing that we've seen coming up time and time again through our meetings. They also keep coming back to this idea of the safety of CCS. So making it clear that CO2 itself is a safe, inert gas is very important. This wasn't clear to our citizens in the first few meetings that CO2 wasn't flammable, for example. A few of our citizens asked whether CO2 was flammable, whether it might explode. These might seem like obvious questions, but it highlights the need to really take a step back in these sort of conversations and make sure that you are engaging from trying to establish a start point where everyone understands the basics, and then you can start to develop these more complex conversations. As I say, once they sort of established that CO2 was a safe gas, there were still ongoing questions around safety and insurances that there was monitoring and plans in place should something happen. So whilst there are lots of technical issues that have been discussed throughout this process, we have seen a lot of societal questions coming up. So the impact on the local community, for example, questions around safety for the community, and the economic impact it might have on them as individuals as well. So from our sort of process that we've taken, there are a couple of key learnings that have come out of this. What we found is that our local citizen group see the need for CCS and they understand why it's important and are broadly supportive of it. But they still have these concerns around the local issues that might occur. The development of it, whether that would just be disruptive to their normal lives, and whether there were any safety or regulation implications for the local community. And they still remain to be convinced around the feasibility of whether CCS is possible on a much bigger scale. We've been talking to them around the potential, but we don't have in the UK a major site to point to, especially onshore. So there is a concern around whether it's feasible. But we have found that the citizens are generally very engaged in the conversation, and they are asking complex questions. So whilst there were early questions around whether carbon dioxide was a safe gas or might explode, there are lots of complicated and insightful questions around the process and what's happening, and it highlights this sort of need that you need to avoid complex language or buzzwords, but you do need to be open to and not simplify to a significant degree the conversations as well. We've also found that the citizens are very appreciative that their questions are addressed, and that we are tailoring this process around them. So whilst some of the questions we may not be able to answer in the room, we may not have an appropriate specialist who can answer them, but we will always go away and find out the answers to any questions that they have, and we'll come back in the next meeting and say, oh, you were asking about this particular topic. This is the answer to those questions. Is it helpful? What does this mean to you? And just keep asking them these sort of follow-up questions to elaborate and to understand their concerns and why they may have them. So generally the process we found has been fruitful, and we've highlighted a real need to develop this sort of approach to public engagement, which is focused on the citizens and their questions. They are appreciative of the work we're doing, that this is being built around them, and we're starting to uncover different ideas and aspects of CCS that we weren't expecting to be concerns, but which are. And similarly, there are areas that we thought the citizens would be most concerned about. So the presentation of data, or there being lots of data and information for citizens to access, we thought at the beginning of this process might be key for them. But actually in our last meeting, the consensus from our group was really they're not bothered about seeing all this data, and they just want to see general overviews, and that they want to highlight how that data will be used, but they don't need to be able to see it. They're not really that interested in reading through lots of data. They just want to know that it's available, and that somebody is looking at it and how it fits into the broader picture, and an explanation of the processes, and how it's being regulated and how it affects them or the local community is very important to them. So generally, overall we found this co-production approach to be very effective, with lots of interesting questions coming out, and that we would strongly recommend that going forward, that this sort of approach is adopted in some way, or to some more or lesser degree, of asking questions around the citizens and what they want to know about CCS, rather than just sort of assuming what we think is important, because what we found is that often what we think they will find important, they don't, and that their interests are very different to ours. So if we want to develop public engagement materials that are relevant to local citizens, we need to be informed by what they want to know about it, and develop those technical documents based on feedback from the local citizens themselves. So thank you very much, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them at the end of the session.
Thank you, Will. Very interesting, and also very complementary to the previous presentation, and I guess also from the next one. So we always a little behind the schedule. So again, continue to ask questions to the panel. We already have a couple questions that I will ask after the next presentation. Thank you again. Now I give the floor to Christine. And you're now the presenter. Okay, it's working.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this seminar. So I'm Christina Boomsma. I'm a senior researcher in the social psychology department at Leiden University. I'll be talking today about community compensation. That this is one measure that's being used in the community engagement process. I won't be talking about a specific project, but bringing together experiences from this topic from different literatures and different areas as well. So we've already talked about this in the previous presentations as well. So I think this is quite clear now, that when it comes to implementing carbon capture and storage, it's really important to think about public perceptions. In the Netherlands, for example, several demonstration projects have been cancelled in part due to a lack of public support and concerns by the local community. These tended to be concerns about safety, the idea that carbon capture and storage is more of an end-of-pipe solution and it's not really a solution to climate change, for example. And there's also a lot of concern that it might slow down the development of other sustainable solutions. So when we look at how CCS is viewed among the general public compared to other technologies, we tend to find that it's only slightly more favorable than shale gas or nuclear energy. And when looking at the general public, there tends to be a lukewarm acceptance if it's put in the context of climate change and the need for making large cuts in CO2. So while there might be many different underlying reasons for opposition to carbon capture and storage, one common perception is that the costs and benefits might not be distributed in a fair way. So what I mean by that is that the costs of a project are usually felt more locally or regionally, while the benefits might be at an international level, for example, meeting climate objectives or certain revenues. So there might be less public resistance, or at least this is the idea, if there is more of a balance between local benefits and perceived negative impacts. And one way this has been done before is by offering host community compensation, which is a form of equity adjustment aimed at correcting these imbalances between the international benefits and local burdens associated with the siting of new or expanded facilities. Now, when I'm talking about burdens, this can be many different things, such as economic losses, but also impacts to human health, for example. And for community compensation, there's many different forms as well that this may take. So it's not just offering money to a local community. Community compensation can also be a regional fund or a local fund that can be used by the local community. It can be things that improve the local economy or improving the local infrastructure, or, for example, promotion of local employment. So it can take many different forms. And it can also have many different functions. So it might be a way of compensating for costs in case of an incident, but it can also be used as a way to reward the local community for assuming certain risks, for example. The work I'm presenting here is part of the Align CCUS project. This is an interdisciplinary European project that looks into 6 specific interlinking areas of research into industrial CCUS, and it's focusing on 6 industrial regions in particular in the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Norway, and Romania. And the work I'm talking about today is part of work package 6, which looks at implementing CCUS in society. This work package is led by Emma Mors in Leiden. And the aim of this work package is to conduct innovative and applied research, which then will hopefully lead to theory and evidence-based tools, and provide practical recommendations for CCUS stakeholders. There's 3 subtasks. The first one is assessing informed public opinion about industrial CCUS. The main research output here is an informed polling questionnaire that we're currently in the process of designing and will be starting data collection soon. The third task is changing the conversation about CCUS in Europe. The main research output here is assessing stakeholder perceptions through a review and stakeholder interviews, and then using input from all the different tasks to design new communication messages around CCUS. And this task is led by Professor Jülich and University in Romania. And the task that I'll be talking about today mainly is the second one, which is led by me. And is looking at a fair distribution of perceived costs and benefits, how to design effective community compensation strategies. Within this task, we're doing a review to look at different compensation schemes in different countries. This is then followed by interviews with community engagement officers to look at best practices and knowledge gaps. And finally, we're running quantitative studies to test the effectiveness of different compensation schemes and looking at which aspects of compensation are important in terms of its effectiveness and how it can contribute to acceptability of a CCS site. So when it comes to the literature on community compensation and CCUS, what we need to know more about is what the role different forms of community compensation could play, and also the conditions under which community compensation could contribute to preventing or solving CCUS siting controversies. Now, there's limited research on this topic within the CCUS context, even though the technical development is now moving forward, and countries across Europe are implementing new plans to develop CCS. There's still very limited research on, particularly on community compensation in the CCS context. There's a lot more literature in other fields, for example, in renewable energy, especially wind energy, where community compensation has been used a lot more. So the literature review that I'm talking about here will also draw on literature from other low carbon technologies and subsurface activities. And what the aim is here is that by identifying key debates in the literature and also by examining compensation practices in different countries, we hope to come to a set of lessons and knowledge gaps for community compensation in the CCUS context. So from the literature, we identified 4 key debates around community compensation. These are topics that are being discussed in different papers, and topics that tend to come back in the literature a lot. Some of these, there's a relative consensus of best practices, and in particular about the first 2 debates, while others are more recent debates in the literature, and there's no clear consensus yet, and there's still quite a lot of knowledge gaps. So with regards to the first debate, finding a fit between type and form of compensation and local needs and concerns. So this is something in general for community engagement that came back in Aaron's presentation as well, the importance of linking what type of community engagement, how you involve the local community to the needs and concerns that are actually there. So there's many different forms of compensation that could be used, that could be implemented, but the general agreement in the literature that it's very important to start with the local community, seeing what their needs and concerns are and how you could fit a type of compensation to what is needed. However, there's a number of challenges there, in particular around who the relevant community is. In the literature, there's often talk about the complex nature of a community. When we think of a community, you might think of a very close group of people, but in practice, communities are not necessarily cohesive groups. There can be different communities of interest, different interests within a certain community. They can have different opinions, for example, of the development, but also and in extent they want to be involved, and from this involvement should be what kind of community compensation, for example, they would be interested in. And the second important question here is which impacts should count. So if we're talking about compensating for certain impacts, what impacts should we look at? What we know from previous research is that a place, a community or a landscape can hold very different values and meanings for people, and a new development might be seen to threaten some of these values or meanings, and it will then be a challenge to find what kind of compensation you could offer to account for a threat to these values. Sorry, I forgot to mention one thing. So in general, when it comes to finding a fit between type and form of compensation and local needs and concerns, for community compensation to be effective and accepted as well by the public, the general consensus is that the social context needs to be considered and the project should be flexible enough to adjust to the needs and concerns of a local community. And this links to this next discussion point in the literature, which is that community compensation should be part of a public engagement process and not just be used on its own. When we only focus on the balance of costs and benefits, we neglect other factors that may influence people's view towards the development. So community compensation is really only one part, and it might do little for public acceptance if there's no wider decision-making opportunities for local communities. Two variables that often come up in the literature are trust and fairness. And this is something that I also heard in the other two presentations, the importance of building trust and making sure that decision-making processes are seen as fair are very important factors. Also, when it comes to community compensation, you can't separate an individual's perception of the fairness of a community compensation package, for example, from their perceptions of the fairness of a decision-making process in general. And one thing that's important here is that local communities have a meaningful voice, so that they can have actual control over the decision-making process when it comes to community compensation, rather than being given an offer where they can say yes or no. It's a lot more effective when people actually have a meaningful input here. Then we come to a more recent discussion in the literature, which is around institutionalization of community compensation. So with some exceptions, most community compensation practices are ad hoc and they lack regulation. That tends to be a lack of formal guidelines or structures in place on whether and in what format developers should offer community compensation. Now, this has downsides, but also offers some benefits. One of the benefits of this voluntary approach is that different stakeholders can rationalize compensation in ways that suit their own perception and interest. As I said, community compensation can have many different aims. For example, as I said, rewarding the local community or compensating for certain impacts. And as long as there's no formal guidelines, this gives flexibility to adjust to local context, what community compensation is used for and when it's implemented, and what format it might take. So that makes it slightly easier to adjust to the local context. But there's downsides as well. What has happened in the past is, because it's a voluntary approach, developers might be a bit reluctant to discuss details of potential compensation until quite late in the project, and then it might become another aspect which arouses public suspicions. This is also related to the bribing narrative that often surrounds community compensation. So the idea that it's just being used to bribe the local community into accepting a project, when community compensation practice would be more regulated. It might become more standard procedure rather than being seen as a voluntary act that is used to win public support. At the moment, the recommendation from the literature tends to be to offer a mixed approach to regulating community compensation, to offer legal controls, to provide a framework to operate in, but also make sure that this does not limit opportunities for negotiations between local communities and developers to decide on the level, form and distribution of community compensation based on specific local needs. The final key debate in the literature at the moment is regarding community compensation for onshore and offshore developments, and in particular the difference in how this process might go for onshore and offshore technologies. Now, what the literature tends to say that it looks like companies feel less compelled to give community compensation for offshore projects, while especially in the wind energy sector, there's a sort of an acceptance that they should offer community compensation of some form, even if it isn't legally needed. One reason why this might be the case is that offshore technologies are sometimes seen as possibly easier to site. Maybe the harms are lower, the economic benefits might be seen as greater. However, when we look at previous studies that have looked into this, especially again in the wind energy sector, they found that the factors that influence public responses to offshore wind are largely the same as those that influence public responses to onshore wind. And there's no support for a universal preference for offshore developments over onshore developments. And a few studies that have been done in the CCS context, they tend to find a similar thing. So one study, for example, in Germany, they found that among the general public, offshore storage was preferred, but when they looked at a local coastal community, there was no preference there for offshore or onshore storage. So it very much depends on the context that you're in, which community are you asking about this preference. Also, for many people, the sea has a distinct sense of place and associated values. It has to be seen as a special place where human structures do not belong. So even though offshore developments might be further away from where people live, it still has a very important meaning for them. Other things to keep in mind is that local communities may perceive themselves as less able to challenge a project when it's placed offshore, and also because it's further away, it makes it more difficult to determine who is the important community here, who is the relevant community, and how should we approach them. So I wanted to briefly go through some country case studies that we did. So what we did here is we wanted to look at current practices and policies when it comes to community compensation in the Netherlands, United Kingdom, Germany and Romania. We wanted to look at specifically at the topics which have emerged from the literature review. So this is not a full policy review. Wants to look at publicly available documents such as policy documents or codes of conduct or organizational guidelines which deal with community compensation, or talk about public engagement, which also includes community compensation measures. We didn't find any for CCS, so again we had to look at other low carbon technologies and subsurface activities as well, but because there's definitely a lot of overlap in how we deal with community engagement for these different technologies, it's still very relevant to see how community compensation policies and practices are dealt with currently within these contexts, as this might also apply to the CCS context very much. So in terms of defining community compensation, the communities in most of these guidelines were defined based on a specific geographical area, although some also talks about looking for certain communities that share interest or are impacted by the project in a certain way. Then we also found that community compensation is offered for very different reasons. So some of these are mentioned here. So for example, for compensating for impact, as a way of sharing benefits, as a way to foster or increase acceptance, or as a way to balance the load in terms of the impact and the benefits from a project. So what is interesting to note here is that the two aims that are most common in the guidelines that we found, so compensating for impacts and fostering acceptance, are the ones that were debated most in the literature, particularly from a justice perspective. When we use compensation, foster acceptance, this might suggest that communities who don't oppose a development don't deserve community compensation. Also, when it comes to offering community compensation to compensate for impact, there's a danger that community compensation is used to justify action rather than despite these impacts leading, for example, to a very important loss of values for a local community. So given that these aims seem relatively common, this brings forward the need for safeguarding a fair community compensation process. And to add to this, offering community compensation to balance the load, which is an aim that was identified in the literature as being the more preferable rationale, was relatively uncommon in the current documents. So within these guidelines, community compensation was seen as a standalone measure as part of wider public engagement strategies, or as a starting point to engaging with the public. So only a minority of the community compensation guidelines that we found were regulated by law. In most cases, community compensation was not mandatory, so this is in line with the ad hoc approach to community compensation that we saw in the literature as well. And what was interesting to see here was that the highly regulated guidelines were less likely to include a wider public engagement strategy. So this is in line with one of the downsides of institutionalizing community compensation mentioned in the scientific literature, namely that it might limit opportunities for negotiations between local communities and developers. And it shows that a clear legal framework does not necessarily give local communities a stronger voice. So finally, what are the lessons and knowledge gaps that we draw from the literature and the current practices? Is that it's very important to fit compensation with local needs and concerns. There's still some knowledge gaps here on how to define the relevant community. That might, there's still not some knowledge gaps here on how to define the relevant community, and also which impacts should count here and how that influence community compensation that's being offered. Another lesson is that it's important to offer local communities a meaningful voice. There's still a lot of knowledge gaps regarding effective ways to build trust with the local community and how to overcome perceptions of bribing when it comes to offering community compensation. There's a need to leave room for negotiations when institutionalizing community compensation. And we need to consider community compensation for offshore CCUS as well, but there's still limited knowledge and experience there with offering community compensation within that context. And it will be challenging, for example, to determine the relevant community there. So conclusion so far, community compensation could be a useful tool for citing CCUS developments. There's a number of factors that can influence its effectiveness, and various guidelines are now being drawn up, but there's no clear consensus yet on how it should be regulated. And new technical developments such as capturing CO2 from industry rather than power plants and moving towards offshore storage and utilizing CO2 open up new questions regarding community compensation. Our next step at the moment within the project is that we're basically analyzing our interview data. So we've conducted 35 semi-structured interviews following on from our review work with community engagement officers in the Netherlands, UK and Romania. They were all within the CCS context or other energy infrastructure related projects. And here we're looking at questions such as what are experiences with community compensation measures, what are perceptions of community compensation among different stakeholders, do different forms of community compensation have different goals, and when is community engagement seen as successful here. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Christine. So we can now start the Q&A session. I already have at least three questions in the panel. I will just take back the screen. Okay. Okay. So just a minute. I can be organized a little bit. So I'll turn on your microphone. Maybe we can, if you won't even share your webcam, I will do it right now. So we can see each other. Okay, hello. So first question was from Vit Ladik to you, Aaron. Hello.
Hello.
It was concerning local population at Outway. How many people live around the site and how many of them have been involved in CO2 CRC stakeholder engagement activities? Have there been any local protests?
Okay, so I'll try and answer them all in a relevant sense of order. It's out located in farmland, so we've got the neighbouring farms whom we then have arrangements with so that we can access their lands to do investigations or works, or we lease some land on them, and that's 15. So we've got 15 agreements with the lands around there. In regards to the larger, sort of the wider stakeholder engagement, we actually go out to radiuses around the outside of our site. So like, we don't get addresses to talk to people, like send them letters immediately, you know, outside of the landowners whom we deal with. What we do is we actually get the local government to send out letters to all of the local landholders to notify them about what's going on at the site. We also then use that to invite people to the open days and the community reference groups. We then put up posters in local notice boards and in the media about the local community reference groups and the open days. When we did our stakeholder engagements, they were calling, and they ended up having, I think it was around 300 participants answering questions on the telephone who wanted to from those local days. And at the open days, we'll get, you know, 100+ people going through the sites at the open days, and the community reference groups can vary anywhere between, you know, 20 to 50 people coming back. So there's quite a large number of people that we engage with, and we try and engage as widely as we can and permanently we can. In regards to protests, we haven't had any protests specifically against our site down there. I'm sure, like everybody else, you know, you've had the anti-fracking movement move through your areas, and in Victoria there have been some large numbers of protests around fracking, and, you know, don't have onshore gas and fracking in Victoria. So we've had those, but we haven't had any protests against our site. So I hope that answers the question, and if Vit wants to ask any more, please do so. So I think that's everything that he was sort of looking for and everything I can answer.
Okay, thanks. No, I think it's answering. So I will just read through the question first, then we can maybe come back to some details. So the second question from Rebecca Bell is to you, Will. Is the approach used in Nottingham similar to a citizens' jury, and what are the differences?
So the approach we're taking varies slightly to a citizens' jury in that we're not presenting all the information around the topic up front and then asking the citizens to debate whether they feel it's a good idea or not, or a particular point of view. What we're trying to do is give them some information around a particular topic. So we began with a general overview of CCS and then started to ask them more questions. Like what do you want to know more about? What are your questions so far? How are you understanding this information? And from there, we started to work with those questions as a basis. So every time we had, we go through the previous session, look through and identify some of the key questions that were coming out, and then develop the next session with our citizens around that particular topic. So I think the key difference is that we're following them through their experience of learning around this topic, rather than giving them all the information up front. So it's a sort of a guided learning process, but we're being guided by them as citizens, not the other way around. So we're producing information based on what they want and what they feel is interesting, so that the materials that we produce at the end of the process will have been developed by citizens and their questions, not by us as scientists. Okay,
thank you. Then I have a question for all speakers. It's from Chris Consoli from the Global CCS Institute, and he asks, there is a single statement made within all presentations. CCS is seen as part of the problem due to connection with fossil fuels. What insights do you have to change that narrative? Maybe we can start with Christine. So.
Yeah, so I think that is an issue. We found that as well in some of the interviews that we did, that was mentioned as a concern, and often the link is made between CCS and fossil fuels, and how implementing CCS might limit renewable development. In our project, because we're looking at industrial CCS, we're trying to think about how we could change that narrative, where we try to get the message across that, especially when it comes to industrial CCS, there's other emissions that at the moment we don't necessarily have a technical solution for, and CCS offers an opportunity there to capture these industrial emissions. But I don't necessarily have the solution yet and how we could change that narrative. We've done some media analysis as well, and we tend to find that it comes back over and over again, that this discussion is coming forward, even though the Netherlands is now focusing on the industrial CCS and trying to move away from using CCS with power plants. There's still a lot of discussions around concerns that we're just extend our use of fossil fuels. So I'm not sure if any of the other speakers have a solution on how we could actually change this narrative.
Do you have yeah, Will?
I don't have a solution as such. It's certainly something we've discussed in our citizens groups. There was a consensus, I think, amongst our citizens that whilst the energy companies and the oil companies were the ones to are partly responsible for this, they're also the ones with the expertise to solve the problem, and there needs to be some sort of societal pressure to encourage them to be more receptive and responsive to CCS, and ostracizing them may not be the best solution, because you really rely on them to have this expertise in effectively drilling holes and taking and putting things in and out of the ground is what they do best. And we, for CCS, need that skill set and information, so we should try and work with them as much as possible. I know it doesn't give a solution to the narrative, but it was the sort of the consensus of our group was that you need to work with the oil companies to use their skills and experience to solve this problem.
Thank you. Aaron, do you have something to add?
I agree with both of the other presenters. You know, we've had those discussions with the stakeholders in our community reference groups and those sort of areas. You know, there's no narrative that's going to change that opinion, because part of it is attached to the fact that you've got the emissions from there. But what we've tried to do with those people in a one-on-one is explain that you're right, you know, it is associated, and the technology that we're using is coming from the oil and gas. But then we've started to talk about the rest of the industries that emit greenhouse gases. And you start to say, look, you know, once you eliminate the oil and gas, there's still a problem with other industries, so that, you know, you're carrying it forward. So it's really trying to explain to them that it's part of a portfolio solution, that, you know, everything needs to play a part, and we go back and we use the information that's been published, you know, going forward, that you've got to rely upon CCS, you've got to rely upon renewables, that everything, you know, everything has a part to play in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and, you know, affecting that. So that's, we're like you know, you're stuck in the space where everyone looks at it and just goes, CCS is associated with oil and gas, you know, and it's just that instant connection that the public seems to have. You know, and you've got to explain the process of going forwards, like you both talked about. Yes, it's associated with it. Yes, the technology comes from there, but this is an enabler to then reduce the impact, you know, and address it that way. So that's all we can do is take them down and just lay all the facts out and be open and transparent.
Okay, and I guess maybe a part of the perception is also linked with the culture. I mean, some people know the oil and gas industry, they live with it, and it may be easier for them than for people who see them as the bad case. I have a question for Christine from Carlos de Dios from Sweden. May you detail some tools for community compensation not regulated by law, which you are studying in your project?
Yeah, so there's actually most of the community compensation measures that we're looking at are not necessarily regulated by law, because as I said, there's still very few that are. So when we look at our interviews and the community engagement officers that we talked to, and examples that they mentioned of community compensation, they were often voluntary that they implemented because it was needed for the local community. This can be things such as in one situation, the local community was very concerned about the impact that power lines might have on their view around their village. So one of the solutions that was being offered was to invest in green spaces in the village, so as to offer sort of one way to also have some benefits of having these power lines here is that we will improve your green spaces. So it's basically a way to offer a local community something as well that might deal with some of the concerns that they have. And when we actually look at how community engagement officers deal with community compensation, they often don't refer to compensation. It's a way that we look at it in the literature and that we talk about it in our research, but when we look at community engagement officers, it's just one of the many things in their toolbox that they use. And a lot of these things that they use to engage with the community aren't regulated by law as such. Only in the wind energy sector do we now find that some of the community compensation is regulated, which is specifically related to having sharing benefits from the wind energy that's being produced, so sharing monetary benefits with the local community. That's the main community compensation that's being regulated by law, but anything else is still very much voluntary.
Do you, I'm asking Aaron or Will, do you, with your, let's say, engagement process with your communities, have had some questions about benefits, local benefits and compensations, and just what's in it for me if I agree to to let you do your operation?
Do you want to go first, Will? Or?
Yeah, I can go first if you like. We have discussed that with our group. There have been a couple of examples of our citizens asking around whether there's a benefit to them. So in the UK, for the shale gas industry, there is a community benefits scheme which was set up by the industry, which gives £100,000 to the community for each well drilled, and then a percentage of the revenue generated from the industry operating at that site, which is given back to the local community. So a real financial incentive. And our citizens asked whether something like that might be implemented. The other question they had around the community benefit, it wasn't so much the benefit, but more of an insurance policy of if something goes wrong and there's a leak or something, there's a failure of some sort, is there an insurance policy for the local community for whether for how they will be compensated, whether there will be any criminal prosecutions, that sort of thing. So it was interesting to see that they were concerned not just so much for the upfront benefits, but around safeguarding themselves in the long term as well.
Do you have some insight also, Aaron?
Yeah, in Victoria, the law around accessing resources that are considered the Crown is set so that the accessing of oil underground is owned by the Crown, so the royalties then are paid to the government. And it's the same intention with CO2, the carbon dioxide injection is, so that it works that way. So any injections that you pay money, it goes to the government, basically as a form of a tax on top of the injection money going in, same as a calculation of a percentage of what you get from the oil. The compensation agreements are typically arranged under a legal compensation. It's just access to the land at the surface, because the resources underground aren't owned by the people who live or farm on the surface. And there's, under the Petroleum Act and the other Resources Acts, there's ways that if the people can't come to an agreement over compensation, it can then be determined under the courts of law. But what we've done is we haven't gone down that path. It's all been negotiation, and agreement so that if we're accessing their land for, say, a survey that's transient, then you pay them an access agreement compensation. So it's like basically, you know, a rent for going onto their land every, you know, once a week or something like that. So that's what goes on with the local landowners that we're impacting from a direct point of view. From an impact to the community point of view, it's more about the benefits that we do. So like we're there, we're a part of the local community, we engage with the local community. For our open days, we hire the local school community funds to come and do the cooking for them. So we pay a donation to them from that point of view. So we then bring them in, and it's that thing of with the industry and the practices that we're doing on the side, it then has those knock-on effects out to them and the knock-on benefits. So that's how it's then done that way. So we don't have a thing where there's a royalty paid to the local community for, you know, the fact that we're putting greenhouse gases underground in the research facility. There's no royalty paid, like there's no royalty paid to them for a coal mine being in the area. You know, that's the Crown and that's the government's property, so then it's considered that way, and the government works those things out. So we're sort of in a separate legislative regime around those sort of ways there, which is slightly different to what I heard Will and you guys saying, which is there's compensations and royalties paid to the landowners or the communities.
Thank you. So is there anyone who wants to ask directly a question? Just raise your hand. I can give you the floor. We are already a little bit.
I had a question.
Yeah. Okay, Christine, go ahead.
I had a question for Will. Maybe I missed this in your presentation, but I was just wondering how the citizens were recruited, and whether you felt like you had a subset of particularly interested people, and what are your thoughts about getting access or information from very uninterested or skeptical citizens?
We recruited through a marketing agency who specialise in, they have a large panel of citizens who they use generally for marketing purposes, so testing new products or services and getting feedback on them. But we asked them to find us 10 people from the Nottingham area from a range of different backgrounds. And we avoided asking for people who had an interest in the environment. We wanted to find people who didn't have that initial interest, so that we could, as you see, say, try and encourage people to come at this for the first time. And when in the first meeting, for example, I think out of the 10 people we had, maybe 3 people had heard of carbon capture and storage before. So they were a very new group. They are interested in more than perhaps most people would. They sign up to this agency to do this sort of work, and we do compensate them. So we don't pay them in cash, but we pay them in Amazon vouchers for their time. So that encourages them to keep coming back. But trying to get, I think, with a disinterested group, part of it is finding something that interests them in the topic, and this can be part of that conversation approach that we've been having with them around asking lots of questions and having those discussions within the group. So rather than a lecture, the majority of the time spent with our citizens is roundtable discussions, them working with pens and paper to write down questions or to even draw their ideas and that sort of thing. So we don't limit them in that respect. So asking them questions and getting them involved, and then starting to pick out areas that interest them around the topic can be a way into discussing complex issues like that. So just finding what interests them and starting from there has been quite useful for us.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another questions from the audience? If not, I had tons of interesting to me questions to ask, but I think we are a little late, and I'm just checking. Yeah, it's we are just 10 minutes shy of 2 hours, so I think we will stay here unless you have something final word to say. No. So I need to thank you very, very much. That was, I think, a very great session we had, very interesting, very complementary. We had three very complementary talks, and Okay, so thank you again. Thank you for all the participants. Again, if you have questions, you can drop me a mail. I can transfer to our speakers. And stay tuned for the next webinars we will have after summer. So in September on quick data analysis on sites. Thank you. Have a good night, Aaron, and good day for the Europeans. And,
thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.